Do you know Peter Pan? This is Peter Pan. And this. And even this. A boy who will never grow up, flying with fairies, fighting with pirates, and living endless adventures. But what if that's not all? What if Peter Pan is the result of a complex genetic mutation that deprived him of the opportunity to grow up? He doesn't need a magic wand, because he is a merciless cannibal who kills and devours people like him. And this is not a horror version of the famous story. This is Australia. I hate to remind you to do something under the video if you suddenly forget. What happens if you combine a reed toad, Australia, and geneticists? Genetically modified toad named Peter Pan. But it all started, of course, not with him, but with observations and studies that lasted for years. Scientists found out that toad and reed toads behave not very family-like when next to them in the pond is a caviar of the same species. They read her smell and perceive unborn brothers and sisters as competitors. The logic is simple. If you are a head of a reed toad and a female toad comes to your pond and lays 20,000 eggs, then 20,000 hungry mouths will appear. When they can eat, they will claim the same food that you eat. Even when you have to share food with one brother or one sister, it can already be unpleasant. But 20,000? In general, tadpoles react a little more violently than some. They devour competitors before they hatch. This is a purely Australian feature. It turned out that reed toads turned into gluttonous cannibals. According to field studies conducted by scientists, 99% of the reed toad's caviar is eaten in ponds where there are already tadpoles. This means that the caviar has practically no chance of survival until the carnivores pass the metamorphosis and leave. That is, until the older brothers and sisters grow up and eat from the parental pond. And this is where genetics comes into play. Scientists were able to bring out the carnivores of the reed toad, which can never grow up. Hence their comparison with the boy, who did not want to grow up. But the Australian Peter Pan turned out to be a super cannibal. He eats about 4 times more caviar than a regular lobster, and does it for months. For comparison, a regular lobster lives in perfect conditions for less than 3 weeks. Peter Pans live up to 3 months. This means that Peter Pans, placed in a random pond, can eat almost all the eggs laid in it for the entire breeding season. At the time when the usual head of a reed toad turns into a tiny toad and leaves the water after 22 days, Peter Pan would keep eating and eating and eating and eating again. And only then, not having the opportunity to metamorphose, they will also die. If reed toads could see nightmares, they would dream of Peter Pan. The creation of Peter Pan began with the experiments with the eggs of the reed toad. Scientists injected special chemicals into them and watched the development with alarm. Normal toads, those that remained without interference, calmly turned into toads. And the toads from the injected eggs remained toads. They grew, developed tiny hind legs, but this was the end of the changes. Months passed, and they still remained toads. They grew larger than usual, but still smaller than many local frogs. The next step was to check how they feed. And then it turned out that Peter and Pen turned out to be very gluttonous, but at the same time deceptive, because they preferred to eat their own kind of caviar. The basis of all this is CRISPR. This technology allows scientists to selectively modify DNA, turn off or turn on certain genes without changing their sequence. With its help, you can block metamorphosis. But this is not the only possible function. At first, the team tested a method for a gene responsible for skin pigment. And everything worked out. We got albinos and heads and adult toads after metamorphosis. But before we move on, we need to say a few words about the reindeer toads themselves. This is one of the most famous predators brought to Australia. The toad was released in Queensland to help the sugar industry fight insects that eat the roots of the sugar cane. The idea, as usual, was not bad. In the 1880s, the country's sugar industry faced a big problem. The larvae of the local beetles actively ate the roots of the reeds. Then, in 1932, a phytopathologist from the Bureau of Experimental Stations for the Cultivation of Sugar, Arthur Bell, attended a conference in Puerto Rico. There he learned about how the American toad Bufo marinus helps to reduce the population of beetles. 3 years later, in June 1935, the entomologist Reginald Montgomery went to Hawaii, where the toads were brought from Puerto Rico. He caught a sample for reproduction and returned to Australia. There, the toad was already waiting for a special aviary, and by August, the reproduction led to the appearance of 2,400 individuals. All of them were released in the Gordon Vale area. However, no one has conducted any studies of the potential impact on the environment. Moreover, the Bureau did not even find out whether toads would eat reed beetles at all. And the toads did not. They settled in the wild, but did not have any significant impact on the predators, only on the ecosystem as a whole, because reed beetles have no natural predators here, which means that there is no one to stop them. Since its appearance in Queensland in 1935, the reed toad has rapidly spread over most of the state. To the west, it reached the northern part of the Northern Territory, to the Kimberley region in Western Australia, and to the south, to the coast of the middle north of New South Wales. And to this day, active progress to the west continues at a speed of about 40 to 60 kilometers per year. In 1950, reed toads were first officially declared a problem species. Their poison is fatal for many local predators, the number of which has significantly decreased since 1935. Toxin is released in a state of stress, and it is strong enough to kill lizards, snakes, crocodiles. That is, almost everyone who considers a reed toad a good option for lunch. In suburban areas, this even applies to dogs and cats. Poison is dangerous at all stages of the life cycle. Swallowing a toxin can cause a clear heart attack, convulsions, paralysis, and even death in some animals. It causes severe pain in people. In addition, the toads, unable to digest food, repel local species. And the Australian government admits that it is unlikely that there will ever be a large-scale method of fighting reed toads throughout the country. Instead, researchers focused on protecting the most vulnerable local species and studying how other animals adapt to the presence of toads. Now, more than 200 million reed toads live in the northern regions of Australia. Their number is constantly and rapidly growing. Females lay up to 30,000 cranes in one laying and can multiply twice a year. In general, Australia really needs some kind of solution. The process of creating thousands of genetically edited egg cells is laborious and clearly not worth the effort. Each egg has to be injected to suppress the gene that produces the metamorphosis hormone. This is not suitable for mass use. Scientists have an idea to solve this problem by releasing the missing hormone into water. This would allow to transfer a part of the heads with a disabled gene to the adult stage. Adult toads, in turn, could produce new heads, but only once. After that, they would be unable to reproduce. If it were possible to grow these young toads to adult sizes and use them for breeding, one hatchling could contain 20 to 30,000 heads of the desired type. In fact, you don't need too many adult toads with genetic changes to create a large supply of Peter Pans. But there are some problems. Scientists are sure that they will be able to solve the problem of growing adult specimens and establish a stable production of cannibal toads. But only in the future. Before the large-scale introduction of genetically edited toads in the field, a lot more needs to be done. Scientists need to study the mass production of Peter pennies, assess their impact, publish the results, and get a social license. Before releasing the Peter pennies into the wild, researchers plan to test their effectiveness in combating reed toads and study possible side effects on local fauna. That is, to do exactly what in the 30s of the last century everyone just ignored when they brought to Australia the toad. It's nice to know that people learn from their mistakes. Permissions to conduct experiments in controlled conditions have already been obtained. This is Western Australia and Northern Territory. While genetically edited headstocks have not been tested in the wild, field tests are expected later this year. After the assessment of risks, the Department of Biodiversity, Nature Conservation and Attractions emphasizes that the results of the project are to be expected before deciding whether the project can be used as a way to control the population of toads. Any future tests in the wild will first be carried out where toads can reproduce only in artificial reservoirs, for example, on pasture dams, in case it is necessary to urgently stop this reproduction. What if something goes wrong? How reasonable is it to introduce genetically edited reptiles of the reed to the population? Scientists admit that the idea itself may seem unreliable, especially to contain invasive species. But unlike gene drives, when organisms are modified in such a way that only males or females are produced, genes are removed here, not added. That is, in fact, scientists simply reproduce the usual mutation, but in a laboratory. As for the risk of population growth of reindeer toads with Peter and Pen, it is considered to be quite small. Genetic consequences are minimal, because the toads will not be able to reach maturity and, therefore, multiply. In general, they are practically harmless to everyone, except for their brothers and sisters. Local frogs and fish rarely try to eat them, and do not get sick even if they swallow several individuals. When scientists put pallets with headbands on the shallow water, the birds also usually do not touch them, and if they eat them, they are treated without consequences. All because Peter Pan is far from as poisonous as toad caviar or adult reed toads. Even intense cannibalism helps researchers. Peter Pan is easy to catch if you need to remove them from the pond after completing the experiments. They willingly throw themselves into traps with bait, so you can quickly get them out of the natural pond if necessary. While the genetically modified tripines are still in development, scientists continue to use other methods of combating reed toads. One of them is also based on cannibalism, but without the participation of mutations. Only on the basis that reed toads' heads are pulled to the relative's caviar, eat it, and thus reduce the competition. They managed to take advantage of this. A specific pheromone was identified, which is associated with caviar. It is used as an active ingredient in baits. When a trap with such bait is in the water, it spreads a smell that attracts tadpoles. They swim behind the loop and find themselves inside, and they can no longer get out. It is considered optimal to install one trap on each 15 to 20 square meters of water surface. The method showed a very good result. In one pond, scientists managed to collect more than 40,000 tadpoles in less than a week. This is the first technology that purposefully interrupts the cycle of reproducing reed toads at the tadpole stage. After all, while they remain in this form from 3 to 20 weeks, they can be massively extracted from reservoirs, depriving toads of the opportunity to give a new generation. Well, you've already understood how it works. The head of the fish is then destroyed, first putting them in the refrigerator for 12 hours, and then in the freezer. Another idea is related to the local ants, which are found in a huge number in the north of Australia. These insects are known as gluttonous predators and turned out to be a deadly threat to the cubs of reed toads. At the same time, the local species of frogs almost do not suffer from their attacks, so the risk to the ecosystem is minimal. Observations have shown that the young of reed toads are more slow compared to local amphibians, but at the same time, they are more active at the same time and in the same place as meat ants. All this makes them especially vulnerable. In some cases, it was possible to record the death of up to 90% of young toads by the edge of the water. More than half of attacks in nature end in instant death, and most of those toads who managed to escape died from injuries within days. When scientists increased the density of ants using artificial baiting, almost all young individuals of the reed toad were found, and most of them were attacked within 2 minutes. And the reason for such vulnerability is simple. The reed toad evolved in South America, where it did not meet large predatory ants. It didn't have protective behavioral traits. In Australia, the toad suddenly fell into an evolutionary trap. However, for now, the ants themselves are not able to contain the number of reed toads. Therefore, scientists are thinking about how to teach insects to look for food on the edge of the water, where young toads are concentrated. In other words, they are thinking about how to poison local insects on the invader. In the north of Australia, sharks and crocodiles have suffered greatly from the invasion of reed toads. In some places, their numbers have decreased by almost 70% because, having eaten poisonous prey, the animals died. To stop this chain, scientists decided to explain to predators that eating reed toads is a very bad idea. Unfortunately, a crocodile that has swallowed a toad cannot take this experience into account in the future because it will die. And people came up with another system. They used the method of training with disgust. In the whole valley of Fitzroy, more than 2,000 baits were laid out, which were toadstools with a remote toxin. Instead of toxins, the toadstools added a substance that caused nausea. The crocodile, having tried such a piece, did not die, but experienced a strong discomfort. So, the animals quickly formed a persistent disgust for the new species of prey. They learned very quickly. On the first night, the predators tried both chicken pieces and prepared toadstools. But by 5 a.m., they almost always chose chicken and didn't even approach the toads. And the result turned out to be impressive. In the areas where mass extinction was previously recorded, mortality dropped to 0. Where toads appeared only to be expected, crocodiles did not suffer any losses because they knew in advance what to do. It seems that the training method was also applied to other local predators, vulnerable to poisonous amphibians. For at least 5 years, weather forecasts in Kimberley were cloudy, with the possibility of sausages from a reed toad. Literally, thousands of raw sausages were thrown off helicopters or scattered over rocky, sandy mountains and streams to prepare animals for invasion. The idea was the same as with crocodiles. Sausage made from toad's paws and stuffed with chemicals that cause nausea will teach predators not to eat reed toads. Moreover, it will teach you how to get to Kimberley by toads. The biggest threat was the northern cormorants and yellow-spotted rams. Unfortunately, unlike crocodiles, learning from rotation did not work here. Research has shown that in the areas where such trainings were carried out, the population of northern cormorants decreased by 94% after the appearance of toads. This is even worse than in the control zones, where the decrease was 65%. In general, we had to look for other options. After the failure with the sausages, scientists switched to studying the local species, which themselves found ways to deal with reed toads. It turned out that some predators are much less affected by toad poison than could be expected. They found a way to avoid poisoning. For example, a keel-shaped snake, a non-toxic species of northern Australia, can eat reed toads without lethal consequences. While other snakes would simply die from toxins, this snake feels great. The reason is evolution. The ancestors of the kili-shaped snake appeared on the continent later than most of the Australian snakes, and they evolved in Asia, where toads with toxins similar to the toxins of the reed toad were already waiting. Thanks to this, the kili-shaped snake was pre-adapted to life with poisonous amphibians. The more famous red-bellied black aspid initially did not have evolutionary predispositions to eat reed toads. Nevertheless, after the invasion of these amphibians, it quickly adapted. In areas with high toad density, the population of snakes began to show greater resistance to toxins. Some individuals avoid eating toads at all. Apparently, they tried it, and I liked it. An even more interesting fact: in some places, these snakes' heads have evolved. Such a physical feature makes it impossible to eat large and, accordingly, more poisonous toads, so as not to get poisoned for sure. Also, you probably heard about the crows that turn the toad upside down and eat their soft, not poisonous, bellies. But there are also less famous stories. Black-tailed crows and whistling crows gnaw tongues out of toads. The Australian sultan was noticed for the murder of a reed toad, after which the bird pulled it out of its mouth, ate the edible part, and fed it to the chicks. Not only birds and snakes have learned how to protect reindeer toads. Among mammals, there are also specialists. In 2014, people discovered streams infested with reindeer toads' corpses, which were clearly attacked. Every morning they found up to 5 new toads with small, almost identical cuts. The discovery showed that larger toads had their hearts and liver removed, and the toxic saline bubble was carefully removed beyond the thoracic cavity. Medium-sized toads, in addition to their hearts and liver, often had their poisonous skin removed from their hind legs. Their muscles were completely devoured. All this was so interesting and unusual that it was decided to prepare the rotting bodies of toads in water at a temperature of 40 degrees. With the help of infrared cameras and bite analysis on the muscles, it turned out who was the cunning attacker. Rackles, a local water rat that looks like a slender beaver. Apparently, if the rackles swallow toxins during the process of cutting the toad, these toxins still cannot really harm. There is very little time left before the implementation of an ambitious project, the goal of which is to stop the invasion of the reed toad. To do what no one else in Australia has been able to do. A group of scientists united with landowners, livestock farmers, and the government of the state to create a barrier between the desert and the sea. This dry shield should stop further invasion into Pilbara and protect the local species. If this is not done, the invasion can add at least 9 new species to the list of endangered species. The plan has been in development since 2016, but the matter has not yet come to fruition. Although the essence is quite simple: to use a natural, narrow place between the Great Sand Desert and the Indian Ocean, between Broome and Port Hedland. The region would be impassable for toads, if not for several livestock farms with artificial waterfronts on an area of 40 by 400 kilometers. There are no natural water sources here, and those that are found are not permanent. At the same time, invasive species need fresh water to survive the dry season. There will be no water, there will be no toad. A controlled experiment in 2019 showed that toads can walk only 5.35 kilometers in 5 days without access to water, before they die. Scientists believe that any movement of toads through a narrow space during one wet season will be stopped by the onset of a dry winter. In fact, the water will be managed in such a way that the cattle can get to it, and the toads cannot. If this is achieved, then the invaders will really be stopped. The project is based on more than 10 years of scientific work by many people. Today, its value is estimated at $18 million. And this is not so much, because toads can damage the Australian iron industry worth $136 billion. Namely, it provides a third of the income of Western Australia. Therefore, it seems better to pay. As part of the project, The modernization of existing gutters, the removal of dams for turkey nests and old artesian wells is planned to strengthen the dry barrier. Only this needs to be done as quickly as possible in order to have time before the appearance of toads at the beginning of the season of rains of 2027 to 2028. But that's not all. After experiments and traps, it's time for a simple solution to involve local residents. The action is called the Great Reindeer Hunt, and it should unite the residents of Australia against one of the most destructive invaders on the continent. If you go hunting at least once a month in the breeding season, you can almost completely clear the territory if you don't let the toads settle. They don't have time to lay their eggs, and the local animals have a chance to regain their habitat. However, this is not the same hunt in the usual sense of the word. The method has rules. The toad is collected by hand, placed in the refrigerator for a day, and only then transferred to the freezer. Toads fall into a state of constipation, natural for amphibians. Their pain receptors are disconnected, and the freezing process takes place without suffering. It's impossible to completely eradicate toads, but that's not the goal. You just need to keep the numbers down until nature finds a balance. The more animals learn to handle toads safely, the closer the balance will be. But until they learn, they need the help of people. And here the main thing is not to confuse the victim. A mistake can cost the lives of a local frog, which is not at all an enemy of the ecosystem. It is not difficult to distinguish them, but you still need training. The reed toad has noticeable poisonous glands on its neck and a rather serious face. Local frogs look completely different, as if they are smiling. In general, in order not to confuse, the organizers of the action to collect toads advise to use educational materials and even join specialized groups on social networks where they help with determining species. It is this mass involvement that should become the main weapon. If thousands of people throughout the country begin to regularly find and destroy reed toads, there will be a chance to protect the Australian nature from an invasion that has been going on for almost a century. See you soon!